Hello, and welcome to the Vertex Invoice IQ webcast. I'm Dana Sessa, and I will be facilitating today's session. Before we begin, I'd like to make a few announcements. The presentation slides have been made available in the Resources tool in your audience console. Please direct all your comments and questions to the Q&A tool, and we will address them at the end of the session. This event is being recorded, and we will be sending out an email notification when the recording and slides are available. Today's agenda, we will be presenting an overview of the challenges of global invoicing, and then we will get into the product, Vertex Invoice IQ, where Fion's going to walk through a product overview and the features and the benefits. And then David is going to do a live Invoice IQ demo. And we are also going to be discussing another new product called Vertex Validator. And then we will head into the Q&A. So today's presenters are Fion O'Shea. Fion is a Vertex product manager with a background in payments and e-commerce solutions. He is the product manager for Vertex's e-commerce solutions, managing the evolution of our e-commerce solutions to deliver market access to e-commerce sellers. David is a Vertex sales engineer and has 12 plus years in tech sales and solution design, spanning almost all core functions within enterprise technology stacks, from underlying hardware through to sales enabling software. That concludes today's announcements. It's time to get started, and I am turning it over to our first presenter, Fion.
Thank you very much, Dana. Thank you all for joining our webcast today. Delighted to have the opportunity to talk about two of our new products that we brought to market for our customers. And as Dana said, looking at the various challenges around digital invoicing and tax ID validation. So before jumping into the Invoice IQ, first, I just wanted to pull up this slide around the international sales journey. And historically, Vertex has focused its development and capabilities really around tax determination and tax calculation. And that's the blue circles here, the kind of lighter shade blue circles. But as you can see from this flow, there are many other tax-related activities that happen both before and after the tax calc and determination. And each and every one of those activities represents a challenge for a seller, and a challenge that is generally replicated in every new market they expand into or are operating in. So we saw it as a challenge, and when we acquired Taxmo, we received these capabilities that really look at the various different challenges. So a solution that was centered around market access. And that's really where we're trying to go, is delivering our tax calculation, but also adding those tax calc ancillary capabilities so that we can provide greater support to our sellers, remove and reduce those tax burden and obligations to facilitate market access, and also reduce the, tax burden of existing markets that are being sold into. So with that said, I'm going to begin with our Invoice IQ solution, but I think what is beneficial is to first differentiate between invoicing legislation and e-invoicing, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about on the market recently. So when we talk about invoicing regulations, it's really about the regulations and the rules set up by tax authorities on invoices created and issued to the buyer. So rules on that transactional document that goes to the buyer. When we look at e-invoicing, it's different in it is regulation that sets out rules on that transactional data that is sent from the seller to the tax authority, generally in real time. But there the difference is the transactional data in e-invoicing is being sent to the tax authority, where with invoicing and our Vertex Invoice IQ product, it's around the document being sent to the buyer. So I just wanted to clarify that from the beginning so that there's no confusion in people's minds as we're walking through the product. So I suppose, what is a tax compliant invoice? Well, each tax authority sets out its own rules on the format and data elements that need to go into that invoice document that is sent to the buyer. Those rules vary across each jurisdiction, but generally we have a few, just to give an idea, we've listed a few of those various different rules and requirements on invoices. And we'll kind of briefly walk through them now. The first two here, if I go down around the right, really deal around the localization. So the first one is the bilingual invoice, and that is the requirement to convert your invoices into the local language of the buyer. To help explain that, if I take Saudi Arabia as an example, so as a seller there, I need to be able to produce my invoices in both English and Arabic. Again, following on with the localization, and quite a comprehensive challenge for invoicing here is around the local currency and FX management. So if I sell a product in a currency that is different to the currency of the buyer, the local currency of the buyer, I need to convert the sale into the local currency of the buyer, and I need to include the FX rate. What makes that quite difficult is not only do I need to convert it, but the tax authority applies rules on that conversion. The first being is that they will stipulate the rate source. Generally, that will be a local domestic rate source that they apply. And that is where I need to find and source my rates for the conversion. In addition to that, they also have rules around the time point. So what rate must I take when I'm doing that conversion? And that can vary from, today's rate, yesterday's rate, the average rate across the previous month. And it varies again across jurisdiction. So in converting my sales into the local currency, I need to, number one, pull those FX rates from a particular source. And number two, I need to manage the logic of which rate I pull. Again, as I said, today's rate or yesterday's rate. It varies. Again, what one that kind of varies across regions is around signatures. Different tax authorities have rules around it. Some tax authorities will require that you include the signature of an authorized person within the selling entity. We have seen some tax authorities in South America where they need to include the signature of the local tax agent. And again, that varies across the regions, in what signature needs to be included. And obviously the various signatures, different regions, you'll have different local tax agents. So they need to be applied on the applicable tax agent for the applicable region. Here, kind of around the audit management, there's an ask and a requirement on sellers to store their invoices up to a regulated time frame. That varies. Generally, we see somewhere between 2 and 7 years. But for audits, a customer may be, they can be asked, and in an audit, they up into that regulated time frame, they need to be able to produce those invoices. The last area here really is just around different rules relating to different types of transactions. So if I look first with B2B transactions as opposed to B2C, there's generally additional data elements that have to go into an invoice for it to be compliant. That could be the tax ID of the business. It could be generally a description of the goods or service being sold. And then another reverse charge, so a type of B2B transaction, but where the reverse charge mechanism has been utilized, there's a specific text that needs to be included in an invoice. That text, again, varies across the region, but that needs to be applied on all transactions where the reverse charge mechanism has been applied. So there's quite a lot of requirements and data that goes into an invoice for it to be compliant in the applicable region. The complexity is heightened, and as I said at the very beginning, is each jurisdiction applies different rules. So every jurisdiction has their own nuances in what rules they apply and how those rules are applied. Again, just back to my last example on that reverse charge mechanism notice, that text, which is a specific piece of text that has to be applied, that varies across each of the regions. So that adds complexity in not only meeting the requirements, but having the logic to determine the region and the applicable template and rules to be followed. again, where I mentioned around the localization, that can add quite a lot of complexity. So being able to convert your invoices into multiple languages is no easy feat, but also in particular around that FX management and the currency localization. For a seller, that means either manually going to the FX sources and pulling in the correct rate and applying it on the invoice, or if you're trying to do a real-time invoice and automate that, that requires a build and a maintenance of an integration to the domestic FX sources, which is quite a significant project when it's just for invoicing. Involved in this invoicing space, there's a risk to take it where you do it by yourself, because this is quite an evolving landscape. So the international invoicing rules are evolving greatly, in particular in e-commerce and digital goods with new legislation rollout. So there's quite an undertaking in not only from the beginning getting the capturing the requirements and building that into your solution, but then tracking and monitoring the various different regions, so to ensure that your solution is remaining up to date with the various tax changes. So just after walking through the requirements and the complexity at a high level, we're going to jump to one poll question here, one of two. And really, in the last few slides, we talked about the complexity of those requirements and managing it internationally with the variance across different regions. The question we like to ask is, are you surprised by that level of complexity in generating a tax compliance invoice, or is this something you're aware of and nothing new? So we'll pause there for a minute to allow everyone to select the choice there that meets their. So just in case there's any issue with viewing it, the three options we've provided are very surprised, some bit surprised, and not surprised at all. Okay, let's move across to the answers. Okay, somewhat in the middle. Okay, so we've got heavily 50%, some bit surprised, 40% not surprised, and then 10% very surprised. So yeah, I think what we've come up against is, and that's why I think with the some bit surprised, when we've talked to customers, generally there has been a high level of surprise at the requirements because they've been using solutions for their invoicing that didn't have or weren't going after this compliant piece, and were a bit shocked. And it was really when they came because there was an issue, and we have seen as well customers coming is aware of the tax challenges, but not to the same level. So they understood some of the high level requirements, but not to the same depth of it. So I'm expected to see the some bit surprised. I thought the very surprised would be a bit higher, but that's a good fact find for us. So thank you for participating in that question. Okay, so when it comes to managing the invoicing challenge, what have we seen sellers do? So put in a few options here. What we have seen is customers issue non-compliant invoices. Again, coming back to the last question, sometimes this is being done because they weren't aware of the tax obligation on the invoices, or in some instances, they believe, look, it isn't a priority for us at the moment, and we'll continue with a basic template across all regions. Then we generally have customer interactions or interaction with prospects when it creates an issue. So not only does issuing non-compliant invoices put you at risk of non-compliance and facing penalties from the various tax authorities, but we've seen it also affect the customer user experience. Various different reasons why, but if I take one example to maybe help explain there, what we saw with one customer, some customers, is they were issuing invoices on their B2B transaction. So tax was applied on the sale, and the business buyer post-transaction went to go collect or reclaim their tax from the tax authority. But due to the fact that they had a non-compliant invoice, that actually became a blocker. So the tax authority weren't happy to release the funds and send back out the tax because the invoice that they'd been issued wasn't compliant. And that then creates an issue and a negative experience for the buyer that then feeds up to the support team, creating issues. And again, it's building jobs for the support team, but it's also affecting that user experience, which sellers obviously do not want to do. We have seen certain customers limit their market. Again, it is a way of stopping it and I suppose minimizing the complexity of managing the invoices. But really, it's not an option that is a long foreseeable option to limit your sales. Really, you want to open markets where there are sales, and applying those constraints isn't one that sellers tend to want to do for a long time. We have also seen, so as I mentioned, some of the platforms, whether it's ERP or e-commerce platforms, are producing invoices, but they don't have all of the required formats and rules required to meet the compliance standards set up by the tax authorities. One way of adjusting that is to manually update the invoices, which some companies have done. Again, it's manageable for a short time, but as transaction volumes go up, that becomes a very expensive and time-costly project and process to do, and can become a significant cost. Another one is building the solution yourself. So managing those compliance requirements yourself, it's an option. When we link back, some of the requirements are possible to generate the templates. Where we have seen there being challenges is, again, around that FX management, maintaining, building the FX integrations, those external integrations is a big undertaking. And also, again, with the evolving legislation, it increases and builds quite a significant risk in trying to maintain up to date with the various changes legislation and requirements that you're producing your compliant invoices. So what do we have with our Vertex Invoice IQ solution? It is an API-based product. The various pieces of transactional data are sent to the endpoint. So through that, we capture the details of the sale, the buyer region, the applicable tax jurisdiction, and based on those details, we can spin up the compliant invoice. We'll identify the region, identify the level of requirements that need to be applied, and spin up the correct and compliant invoice. Again, API-based, so that is compatible with the various different platforms. So whether you were looking to plug this directly into your e-com website, an e-commerce platform, ERP, CRM, it's a simple API endpoint, so that is compatible with the various different platforms. One thing that's quite important with this solution is its ability to support configuration and customization. So every seller has different invoicing requirements. One size does not fit all. So really, we're trying to build as much configuration in there so that you can tailor this solution to work exactly how you need it for your customer, for your specific requirements. So whether that is how the invoices are issued, whether you produce invoices for intra-business sales, or whether you produce invoices for $0 transactions. There's a series of rules where you can enable and disable simply to adjust how the solution works. Again, these invoices, they're quite heavy with regulations and to make sure that it's tax compliant, but it's also an important customer engagement point with your customers. So maintaining that brand image and optimizing that engagement point is important to retailers and sellers. So we provide levels of customization there. So whether you put particular text in your footnote or your body or email, apply your own logo, there's various different options there so that you can maintain and drive that brand image. Again, a big part here, so the API based, it's really automating that invoice process. So adhering to the various different regulations around invoicing, but instantaneously producing an invoice with no manual interaction so that you can automate that invoicing process as part of your sales journey. Again, I mentioned that flexible issuance of invoices as part of the configuration. So today we offer various ways that you can collect and send those invoices. So whether you would like Vertex to issue the invoices directly to your customer, whether you'd like to pull those invoices into your system, make them available or email out to your customers, and also the format of those invoices. So whether you want it to be a HTML or PDF format. Both are covered with the Invoice IQ solution. And finally, which I hadn't talked about, so when we talked about the invoice, I was talking about the sales. Obviously, you are going to incur refunds, and with that, you need to be able to produce a credit note. There are rules around a compliant credit note, the big one being that it's linked back to the invoice. So again, that is all catered for within the Invoice IQ solution. So as Dana said, we'll share these the slide deck with you in the coming days. So I won't go into this in detail, but really one thing just to note is the requirements, obviously, that we talked about at the start are all met through the Invoice IQ solution. A key part, again, is around its global support. So we're supporting 60 plus countries today. And with that, it covers the various FX requirements. And again, when it comes to the language localization, we meet the tax authority requirements plus more. So we support 13 languages today, so you can optimize that customer engagement by having the localization possibility for the language. So I'm going to, again, just a quick question here. It's how you are managing your invoicing needs today. So we'll put in a few options. So what I'd like to understand is, how are you creating and issuing your invoices? So is it your ERP, CRM system producing invoices? Is it an e-com platform that is producing the invoices? Are you using a solution? So have you purchased a solution to generate your invoices, or are you managing those invoices internally today? Okay, and yes, so a little less surprised when it came to this question. Generally what we see, it's you're using the CRM or the ERP or your e-com platform, depending on your sales channel, to produce your invoices. But thank you again. So that's the final question. I think it's a good time now. We'll just jump over to a live demo of the Invoice IQ solution. So I'll just put you now, Dave, if you wouldn't mind jumping on.
Great, thank you, Fionn. I'll share my screen quickly, and I see some questions coming in the Q&A. Hopefully this will answer some of them. I'll talk for about 2 or 3 minutes, and that's it. So unfortunately, the Invoice IQ isn't exactly a lovely thing to demo on the screen. It's API based, so there's not a lot of pretty graphics to be seen. Essentially, what we need when we're generating an invoice at the minimum is we need a country value, we need a currency value, we need an amount, and we need a tax rate. Now, for the country value and the tax rate, we can, as part of this process, infer that country based on the details you provide us, and we can also calculate the tax rate based on that country code. So it's entirely up to our customers in terms of what data they want to send. What we see a lot for this standardized solution is, I have already calculated my country, I've already calculated my tax rate, I just need to get the invoice generated that's compliant in the market. If I show you a couple of examples, I'll give you an Irish B2B transaction. So when you submit that API request to us, we'll respond with a number of calculations. Most aren't relevant to this when you're specifying all of the information yourselves. But the key things to point out, this transaction is in USD, but it's for a customer based in Ireland who use Euro. So when the invoice gets generated, it has converted that transaction into that Euro rate as well as part of that invoicing. This was a B2B invoice, which includes a check on the business registered VAT number, which Fionn will talk about in a moment, which means it's also an invoice which requires the VAT reverse charge statement within the EU. Now, if we look at some of the other regions, Saudi Arabia, for example, has a requirement that their invoices must also be produced in Arabic. So when this invoice gets created, we have an English version of the invoice at the top, but we also have an Arabic version of the invoice produced as well. As a final quick one with Taiwan, on this request, I've included an extra couple of details. So while we only require 4 or 5 pieces of information, if there are pieces you want to be returned in the invoice, you can also include them as part of that call. When you submit it to us for Taiwan, Taiwan has rules around foreign sellers transacting in Taiwan, cross-border sales. most notably the e-GUI process, where essentially the invoice numbers are pre-allocated by the Ministry of Finance and sent to the merchants registered. We have a full service around Taiwan specifically for their e-invoicing requirements for these digital sales as well. I'm conscious of time. I'll pass this back to Fionn to walk through the last couple of slides, and hopefully we'll walk through some of those Q&A questions as well. Thank you.
Thanks a million for that, Dave. That was great. So quickly, guys, as I said, with time, but just wanted to give, so this is another product we've brought out. Again, it's centered around delivering market access. So it's our Vertex Validator, and really it's around delivering the validation of tax IDs. So the various use cases, why would you want to validate a tax ID? The first and the main use case we see is in support of the reverse charge mechanism. So for anyone who that may be new to what the reverse charge mechanism is, it's something that can be used on B2B sales. It's supported in VAT and GST regions only, so it's not applicable in the US on sales and use tax, but a majority of jurisdictions in VAT GST land support the reverse charge mechanism. So on a B2B sale where it is supported, a seller can shift the obligation to collect tax to the buyer. And what that looks like then in terms of the transaction is the seller applies a 0% tax rate on the transaction. So no tax is applied on the sale. And then post that, the buyer will pay and deduct the tax in their tax return simultaneously. So what that means for the number one, the seller, is that their product is more attractive because without the tax applied on it, it is cheaper. So it means for the buyer, it's a cheaper product, and then therefore for the seller, it's more attractive. The second part is if they are leveraging the reverse charge mechanism on their B2B sales and they do not have to calculate tax, they may never incur a obligation to file, to register, file, and pay tax. And we know that compliance piece is extremely costly. So that ability to avoid having to register, file, and pay tax in various jurisdictions is a huge benefit. Again, going to the buyer perspective, why is this a good? Number one, it's really just it's the cash flow impact. So I'm not paying tax at the time of transaction, and in fact, I never pay out the tax because I paid and deducted in my tax return simultaneously. So those funds never actually leave my bank account. So it's a big benefit for a buyer. What we have seen is other use cases is verifying a customer's business status. So depending on your product, so some products will have a special pricing for a business buyer rather than as opposed to a consumer. So validating the tax ID helps you apply that strategy. Whether it's trying to protect your platform, so ensuring that those who are using your platform and interacting with the end customer are an actual registered business. Again, leveraging the tax ID helps support that. And then the other use case really is around the supplier verification. So we've seen customers come there. There's, again, multiple reasons as to why you would want to verify the tax ID of your supplier. A big one being as part of that KYC process. So really there's multiple use cases for the validation of the tax ID, but the reverse charge mechanism is the largest one we've seen. So with that, the tax authorities, they require that you validate. So if you're applying that reverse charge mechanism sale, the onus is put on the seller that they validate the tax ID, and to not perform that validation is deemed as non-compliant. So again, there's the benefits of the reverse charge mechanism. A seller needs to validate their buyer's tax ID. The complexity is there's not a single source where you can do this. Now, VISE does offer a solution for tax ID validation in the EU, but that's not sufficient enough. There's other markets where you can leverage this capability and the benefits of a reverse charge mechanism. But to do that, you need to be able to connect with the local databases in the various different regions so you can validate the tax IDs, which is a big undertaking. So what we've done is we've built out those integrations with the various databases, and we've wrapped that up into an API solution. So it's a simple endpoint where we capture the region and the tax ID. Based on that, we will route it to the various regional databases, we'll perform the validation and we'll return the response. So either valid or invalid tax ID. So again, enabling our sellers to perform the reverse charge mechanism compliantly across the globe in more VAT and GST markets than just the EU. Again, look, we'll share this deck. I'm happy to talk a bit further on it in the interest of time and to allow for Q&A. I'll pass through, but really the key part here is it's that global and international presence where we've differentiated with this product, where we really stand alone. So we're supporting nearly about 55 regions today across the VAT GST land, where we've performed that validation. Again, that's 55 regions, countries where our users can compliantly perform the reverse charge mechanism and leverage the ability. One last thing to call out is a new feature to this that we're bringing out is the tax ID validation reporting. So we provide region-specific reporting where you can pull all your completed tax ID validations. The benefit of this is when it comes to an audit, you can share those validations, that report with your auditors, so simplifying that audit process. Okay, so I'm going to we'll just jump to a Q&A. So I'm going to open up here just to find in the chat and open a few questions. So we'll try and take 3 or 4 questions. And what we might do after that is we will respond to each and all the questions. So in the coming days, we will reach out and provide a response to your various questions. But one I have here is, has there always been an obligation to validate tax ID for B2B sales where reverse charge is being utilized? It's always been an obligation, but what we've seen in recent years is the tax authorities are playing a greater onus on sellers performing that validation. So in the audit, we've seen tax authorities are looking for the sellers to provide evidence that they've completed that validation, and they're then pursuing penalties if it's not been done. So obligation's always been there, but a greater focus by the tax authorities. They're looking to target that VAT fraud bill, and they're also looking to get funds in post-pandemic, so a greater focus has been applied. Dave, I think this might be a question for you. So I have one here is, will the speed of these API calls slow down my checkout process?
Yeah, good question. And no is the short answer. So it's typically a matter of milliseconds in terms of the response for these. So we have some customers who use it, right at the point of checkout. We have others who do it after the fact. But if you need to use it at a live checkout environment, it's not going to slow anything down as well.
Perfect. And I think maybe we'll do one more question. So do you support multilingual and have English and the local language on the invoice? So yes, we do. So we produce 2 copies of the invoice. So in that example there on Saudi Arabia, we'll produce 1 copy of the invoice in English and an additional copy of the invoice in Arabic. So we're doing it in both English and the local language, but it's 2 copies that we produce from a single request. As I said, there's a good few questions, so thank you for the interest. I think in the interest of time, we will follow up in the coming days and come back to you on your various questions. But thank you for your time and for the interest, and I will maybe pass back to Dana.
Thank you. Okay, so that concludes today's webcast presentation. We do have quite a few questions that we were unable to get to because of time. So we will work behind the scenes and reach out to you each individually and answer all of the questions that were presented today. So on behalf of our presenters and Vertex, I want to thank you for your participation, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.